Hi everyone, welcome to Rachel's Studio, and in today's tutorial I'm going to give you 5 tips how to start a watercolor painting of a children's portrait like this. This is a painting I did for my online students. It's about a 3-hour real-time tutorial, so be sure to check out the description below to learn how to access that. I started this tutorial with a little twist, which I've never done before with my online students, and that is I started the painting process with a printed out lightened photograph on watercolor paper. So I will talk about that later too. But first things first, I want to talk about the reference photo because you have to start with a good reference photo. So what makes a good reference photo? First off, you really need beautiful light. For this particular reference photo, Parker was in bed with his dad. They were playing a video game and he was really being very nice and still, which is rare for him. And the lighting was beautiful. There was light coming in from the side windows and it was really nice diffuse light, and it was lighting his features really softly, and it was just so perfect. Bad lighting situations would have been flash. Pictures taken with a flash are rarely good reference photos because they are all washed out, and so they're really flat and lifeless because they don't have a lot of good range of values from light to dark. They just have mostly light and mostly dark and not much in between. Another bad lighting situation is afternoon daylight, where the sun is directly overhead and the shadows again are really harsh and the details are really washed out because of the bright light. So that's rarely a good lighting situation either. Other good lighting situations other than diffuse light coming from a window are golden hour. Golden hour produces beautiful photography. That time of the day when the sun is just coming up or just going down, it's low on the horizon, and it makes that golden, beautiful light. I love painting reference photos taken during that light. Now, there are a lot of other different lighting situations that can work, but those are the best. Another thing to consider is how your subject is situated. And 3/4 view is one of my favorite ways to paint a person so they don't look as flat as if they were looking straight at the camera like this or in profile. And so when they're looking in 3/4 view, you can see the topography and the 3-dimensionality of their facial features a lot better. So I really love 3/4 view, and I highly recommend that. Another thing that I would recommend to consider when you're choosing your reference photo is it's so tempting to say you're wanting to paint your grandchild and they have this most beautiful, huge, angelic grin with a whole grill of teeth showing. That makes a great photograph. I agree, but to paint that is a challenge. Teeth are really hard to paint, kind of like hands and paws for whatever reason. They're just really difficult to paint, and there is a trick to it, but it's even better to avoid it. Another recommendation I would take if you have the luxury of taking pictures for a painting is just take a lot of pictures. I took a ton of pictures this particular morning when I was getting reference material for this painting. I took a ton of pictures. I take a ton of pictures every day because about 1 out of every 100, especially of children who are always moving, always on the go, really hard to photograph. So tip number 2 is to use good watercolor paper. Let me show you my favorite. This is my favorite watercolor paper. It's Arches cold press, 140 pound. This is how I buy it. I buy it in big sheets because those little blocks are expensive. So I buy them in these big sheets, and check out the description below where I have links to all my favorite supplies, including this paper. Let me put this down. But anyway, good paper is really important because, especially for a portrait, you're going to be making a lot of adjustments, a lot of fixing, and that takes a lot of wear and tear out on your paper. So you need good paper. You've got to start with good paper, at least 100% cotton watercolor paper. That's a good place to start. But an even better place to start is this Arches cold press watercolor paper. It just holds up better than any other paper that I've used. Hahnemühle, the collection, is another one. Bao is another one that's available on Amazon that is a cheaper alternative that's pretty darn good and pretty darn tough. So those are all good papers. I do recommend cold press if you're a beginner, because if you paint on hot press, you'll soon find out it gets blotchy really fast. And to make a child portrait look good, it needs smooth, even transitions between values and colors. And it's hard to do that on other papers other than cold press. So I do recommend cold press, 140 pound Arches cold press paper. All right, tip number 3 is to use a transfer method to get your initial drawing onto your watercolor paper. Number one, if you try to draw directly onto your watercolor paper, if you're not good at drawing, you're going to have to erase a lot, and that takes a lot out on your paper. And then you're going to start your painting on a piece of watercolor paper that's been erased a lot and probably already damaged to start with. Just so you know, professional portrait artists almost always transfer to one degree or the other, which means, in layman's term, trace, to get their initial drawing onto their watercolor paper. There are many, many ways to do it. You can print out your picture and trace it up against a window or on a light box. You can use a projector. You can use an app like a Camera Obscura app. You can use Autodesk Sketchbook, which I have a whole video about how to trace in this very well-rounded app that has a lot of powerful uses for you as an artist, but one being you can trace in it, and then you can download that tracing and then print it out and then use a light box. I use my windows. I put the line drawing on my window, put my watercolor paper on top of that, use a number 2 pencil to transfer the drawing onto my watercolor paper. Bada bing, bada boom, I'm ready to go. And also, drawing and painting are two very different skills. And so you can learn how to draw by doing a lot of painting, but you cannot learn to paint by doing a lot of drawing. As you paint, you're going to be using your drawing skills, because as the painting develops, you're not going to be able to see that initial drawing or underlying tracing anyway. So you'll really need a lot of drawing skills as your painting develops. And that brings me to how I did this particular tutorial. I actually printed a photo, a lightened photo of Parker out directly onto my watercolor paper. And I rarely do this, but I had an idea that I thought my watercolor students would enjoy having an extra tool and lower their stress by having this directly printed onto their watercolor paper. So if you would like to try painting this, you can actually buy these lightened photographs on Arch watercolor paper from my shop, and I'll put that link below. I use an Epson P800 SureColor printer, and I can print on watercolor paper. So that's another thing that you can do. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you were doing this for a commission or for a serious work that is going to be bought by a client, or you're going to put it in a show, but it's a great way to practice painting, and it just takes out one more dimension of stress. All right, tip number 4 is to use a map. What is a map? It's where you put in the most important points of the painting at the very beginning while you can still see your drawing or your photo or whatever it is that you use to transfer the picture to your watercolor paper. So what I will do is I'll put in, say, the nose holes, I'll put in the corners of the mouth, some of the darkest points like the pupils. And you often hear in watercolor that you have to work from light to dark. But the thing is, if you paint something dark on your watercolor paper first, you let it dry, it's like letting the paint set. And then if you re-wet that area, it might soften it a little, but it will not move. So you can paint your darks first so that you get those in first, and then they kind of serve as a roadmap for where to put the rest of the components of the painting, and you won't get lost, especially in complex painting. This is a great thing to do, but especially when you're doing a portrait and the proportions have to be just right, you can put in this map first, and then they will all be in the right spot in relation to each other, and you can't mess it up. Tip number 5 is to go into painting with the right attitude. You want to have an attitude of, this is just play, I'm going to have fun, but also know that watercolor is a process of just fixing. Really, it is. It's a process of putting down paint, seeing how you like how it looks, and then fixing that, adjusting it. And then sometimes you make this darker and this needs to be darker, or you lighten this and that needs to be lightened, or this is too bright and you need to gray that down. So painting is a series of adjustments, a series of problem solving. Paintings go through an ugly stage. I did do a whole video about that too. And so a lot of beginners get halfway through a painting and they panic because their painting looks ugly. They feel like they've lost control. They have been having to fix a lot of things already, so they already feel like they're failing. Don't feel that way. It's very common when you're starting a painting to feel like you've lost control and it looks like crap. That happens to me still on a lot of the paintings that I start. So just know that's a part of the process. Work through it. You will get there and your portrait will be beautiful. So just keep going. I hope all those tips helped you get started with your portrait of a child. Come share your painting. I would love to see it on my Facebook group. It's a free group. I will put the link to that below. I'd love to see you there. Come join me on Patreon, like this video, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Now go watercolor your world. Bye, everybody.